Hi there, Medical Wildcats. I'm Joseph Guggenheim. I'm a 1972 alum of the medical school. And this month I'll be talking about Chicago and its relationship with water. Has this been a blessing or a curse? On a map, Chicago seems to have an ideal location. There are no hurricanes there, although some people may disagree. There's no prolonged summer heat like there would be in Houston or New Orleans, no major earthquakes. And even though the rain totals fluctuate year to year, with a drought, there's a huge body of fresh water nearby in the Great Lakes. It's also at the in the one of the richest agricultural centers in the world, and just south of what used to be a source of timber. According to the New York Times, water is the reason Chicago exists. And by traversing a small swampy dip in the Continental Divide uh, many years ago, Chicago was transformed from a swampy village to a major business metropolis. The early relationship between Chicago and water includes the elimination of waterborne diseases, which was probably aggravated by the population explosion. Chicago was the fastest growing city in the United States, and the problem with garbage and sewage management. The same water that gave life to Chicago now threatens its future. Climate change has been blamed for storms that are causing unprecedented problems. And the engineering triumph that led to the reversal of the flow of the Chicago River for the elimination of sewage is not without its side effects today. The Algonquin Native Americans named the slow-moving body of water Chicago, meaning stinking onion because of the pungent odors in the area. In 1673, the French missionary Marquette and the French-Canadian explorer Joliet returned to Canada after exploring the Mississippi River as far south as present-day Mississippi and Arkansas. They then paddled upstream, heading for the Fox River and eventually Green Bay, Wisconsin. The local Miami people, as seen in this photograph, showed them a valuable shortcut. I guess they wanted to get to Green Bay before kickoff. If Marquette and Joliet headed for the Illinois and Des Plaines River, as shown in the line on the right, they would encounter a portage where they could carry their canoes across a few miles of swampy land and arrive at the Great Lakes in a fraction of the time of going overland. And the overland route is shown on the left. The portage is shown on the right red line with the arrow at the Chicago portage just at the southwest corner of Lake Michigan. Joliet immediately recognized that this shortcut could accelerate the travel and trade between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River, the two great major transportation networks in the United States and North America. This dip in the subcontinental divide became known as was a popular route for British and fur traders and missionaries. It became known as the Chicago Portage. It was a low spot in the Continental Divide. It was about 12 miles from the lakeshore, and it was a very gentle rise. It was only about 8 feet above the level of the surrounding land, and it was almost imperceptible. As this picture on the right shows, water flowed east from the east side of the subcontinental divide, and as shown in the red arrows, flowed west on the west side of the subcontinental divide. A canal was built across this area, and it was called the Illinois and Michigan Canal. It was built to connect the Chicago River with the Illinois River and eventually to the Mississippi River. It was a 96-mile long canal built for commerce. It was not built for sewage or drinking water. The groundbreaking occurred in 1835, and it took about 12 years. It followed a path the Native Americans had been using for generations to go from the Mississippi site to the Great Lakes. The canal was built largely by enslaved Black migrants from the South and immigrants, especially from Ireland. It was only about 60 feet wide and 6 feet deep. Locks and aqueducts were built to cover the 140-foot elevation difference between Lake Michigan and the Illinois River. By building the canal, the eastern United States and southeast Canada became an island, as seen in this heavy black line, with the island being bordered by the Atlantic Ocean, Gulf of Mexico, Mississippi River, and the Great Lakes system and St. Lawrence River. Now Chicago had access to more markets via railroads and ships. Land prices along the canal and the population and commerce soared with the opening of the canal. The rapidly increasing population was largely due to the migration of canal workers and land speculators. But recurrent epidemics of waterborne diseases occurred: cholera, typhoid fever, and dysentery. And this was blamed on the residents dumping human waste and garbage, including animal carcasses, into the waterways and even the streets. The city was suffocating under its own success, and there was a need for a sewage system. Sewage and wastewater were being dumped into the river and the streets, and it was polluting Lake Michigan, which was the source of the city's water supply. This problem was made worse by the fact that Chicago was the fastest growing city in the United States. Chicago became a city in 1837, and you can see that the population doubled with each decade, sometimes more, sometimes less, rising from the 24th largest city in the country, where it was next to Brooklyn, and then it became the second largest city by 1890. But Chicago was beset by cholera and typhoid fever and dysentery. There were several epidemics of cholera in Chicago, including a deadly one where 5.5% of the population died, including Dr. Rush, the founder of Rush Medical School. And typhoid fever was also in epidemic proportions, with 174 victims per 100,000 population per year in 1891. But many people had no running water. I love this picture from the Chicago Museum of boys drinking out of the horse trough. Those who had running water reported minnows coming out of the faucet. Wealthy residents had their own water wells, but this was sometimes a curse instead of a blessing. The wells and water carts served as the water source for most residents, but the water carts were filled up from Lake Michigan. There were problems, and they were attributed to several causes. There was animal waste in the streets, with livestock being used as a source of transportation. But the wealthy people who had their own wells would often discard human waste from the outhouses and the chamber pots on their own land and contaminating their own wells. Human and industrial waste were just discarded in the streets and the rivers. To make it worse, the Union stockyards opened on Christmas Day in 1865 and became the largest slaughterhouse in the world. Meat packers discarded the livestock remains, including carcasses, bones, eyeballs, and rancid animal oils in the South Branch of the Chicago River. And methane and hydrogen sulfide gas arose from the depths of the river, earning the name of the river Bubbly Creek. Allegedly, a man could walk across the solids floating in the Chicago River, as shown in this picture. Upton Sinclair immortalized the situation in his 1906 novel, The Jungle. So an engineer from Boston was brought in, Ellis Chesbro. The resident said the water was not green or blue as it had been in the past, but was now brown. So the city in 1855 hired Ellis Chesbro to build a sewer system. He was a self-taught engineer, and he recognized there were several problems. The city was built on a low-lying marsh, so that Chicago and Lake Michigan were at the same elevation. Underground pipes would actually be at a lower level than the river. So his mandate was twofold. He needed to establish a sewer system to remove the waste and then also supply the city with drinking water. His first plan was to elevate the buildings, and this was done with a series of jacks that were placed underneath the building, as shown in this artist picture of the Briggs Hotel in 1866. The jacks were placed underneath the building, and on a given signal, workers would turn the jacks to elevate the building up to 10 feet. This would eventually lead to elevating the building above the level of the lake. So pipes could be placed under the building, and then the building was stabilized with dredgings from the lake so that the pipes were above the level of the lake. There were some buildings that were not elevated, and pictures show that the entrances were and windows were basically underground. So the dredgings were used to maintain the elevation of the buildings. The result was that gravity would carry the waste to the river and eventually to Lake Michigan. But then Chesbrough had another problem. He was faced with the problem of contaminating Lake Michigan, which was the city's water supply. His plan was to move waste out of the city, but it was polluting Lake Michigan. So then he had a second idea, and that was to move the water intake sources far out in the lake, away from the waste egress pipes at the shoreline. And the maxim was, the solution to pollution is dilution. By the time the water got all the way several miles offshore, it was thought that it would be diluted enough where it would not be dangerous. I always thought this maxim, the solution to pollution is dilution, was an orthopedic principle for treating open fractures, but I guess it applies to hydrology and public health also. The solution was to build these intake crypts 2 to 4 miles away from the shoreline, and there were intake pipes 200 feet below the lake bottom, several miles in length. And this was an incredible engineering feat, especially when you think that it was done in the late 19th, early 20th century. 7 of these cribs are still in existence, and you can see them from the medical school campus. Only 2 of these are in service nowadays. This was an amazing engineering feat. Workers were working 24 hours a day in shifts for 3 years, laying pipes 200 feet below the lake bottom. These pipes were 10 to 20 feet in diameter, and the work began in 1864 and took 3 years. The water supply, after doing this, was threatened one time by a storm in 1885, but the winds shifted at the last moment, saving the city's water supply. And it was thought that perhaps next time the city would not be so lucky with a major storm. As the city grew, Chesbrough sewer was no longer adequate. So then he had to come up with another plan. He recommended reversing the direction of the flow of the Chicago River by connecting it to the Illinois and Michigan Canal. Remember, this canal was built for commerce, but not for moving water and waste. It was thought that if you could dig deep enough, gravity would reverse the river's flow. The garbage and waste were being dumped into the Chicago River, and then the idea was to send it to the Mississippi River and ultimately to the Gulf of Mexico. Chesbrough's salary was cut, and he did not ever have this plan come to fruition, and he died 7 years later. It was built, though, after he died. The previously constructed Illinois and Michigan Canal was not deep enough to handle Chicago's refuse. So another canal had to be built, and this was the Chicago Sanitary Canal, built in approximately the same location as the other canal to carry waste from ultimately from the city of Chicago and the Chicago River to the Mississippi. St. Louis and Memphis did not want Chicago's wastewater coming down their river. And St. Louis tried to stop Chicago from doing this, and they took the case all the way to the Supreme Court. But they lost the case because it could not be proven that the contamination of the river was from Chicago. So the river reversal was accomplished, and it was done in secrecy on a cold day in January 2nd, 1900. So I'll continue the story of the river next month, and I'll be talking about the reversal of the river and the initial benefits, but later there were many problems associated with this, and there are several proposed solutions for it nowadays. Well, I hope everyone has a very happy holiday season, and with family and friends, and a Happy New Year. Stay healthy and happy, and I look forward to our virtual meeting again in January.